I'm Barry, and welcome back to another, what we call a Sparkination conversation. For those of you that don't know, a Sparkination is a spark that ignites passion, that leads to action, that changes what's normal. And my guest today, special guest, Mark LeBusque. Mark and I, this is actually the first time we met physically, but we've been following one another, it's fair to say, not stalking, but following one another. And what particularly got me interested in Mark's work is he does a lot of work around what it means to be human and what a human workplace looks like. So I thought it would be fun, but also highly rewarding to have a chat. So Mark, welcome.
Ian, thanks for having me. And yes, we have been following each other for some time. I remember your voice very loudly through the LinkedIn. I mean, loudly in a lovely way, to really help even shape me up early on when I was a bit like, how do I hold my spot in this place? And I was just listening to your wise words, and I'm really happy to be here, mate. So thanks for having me.
Fantastic. We were chatting before we pressed the record about when did this dehumanization of the workplace happen, and I think we come to a conclusion it's probably always been that way.
Yeah, it's funny.
But the Industrial Revolution might have sort of made it even worse.
Oh, I think so. It's funny that when you sort of sent through a note to say is a bit of a topic. Give me one sec, mate. There's a bit of a topic there about the rehumanization of work, and I wrote down, has work ever really been human? And I think you're right. The Industrial Revolution, when all of a sudden human beings became units of labor, and humans as outputs, production lines and all of those sorts of things. And it was a bit like, how much more can we squeeze out of them? And let's not get too cozy with them or get to know them, because we might have to fire them and move them on and do whatever we've got to do. So I think it started there. Unfortunately, it's still with us, even though I think we've moved on socially. I think from a work perspective, we are still rewarding the behaviours that we saw way back in the time that this started.
And I found it interesting, and I'm sure you have as well, that since COVID, where we've sort of been forced online. I mean, in my case, I've been predominantly online since 2012, so it's not a new experience for me or my clients. But what I've observed for those that have found it new is that the old habits, the bad, I'll call them the management habits, because I was reflecting before our conversation, Mark, back to 1990. I remember the day, it was September 1990, and I had a group of chief executives in a room in Melbourne. And I made a statement that I thought the idea of people management was a stupid idea and we ought to get rid of it. Yep. And there was actually there was laughter in the room. People thought I was mad, or a percentage of them did. And I don't think there'd be that much laughter today, because people management is a silly idea. And yet some people are sticking with it. And in COVID, it's got worse. You know, we've got some managers. I heard one. This is a member of my family, so but they can't go to the toilet without signing off.
Yep.
I mean,
yep.
What?
Well, it's just human beings will hold on to what rewards them. And unfortunately, we've worked in a system that has rewarded technical competence. So I can remember in my career, I was a school teacher, but I moved out of that quickly and took a job in logistics. And I was working an afternoon shift. So literally, sorting parcels into the right things, loading planes, driving trucks. And I remember at one stage, as a early 20s worker, I used to take home each night the thing that had all the postcodes in it, and I'd remember them all so that I could do my work very competently. And guess what? I got promoted pretty quickly into the call center, and then I could find missing parcels. So then they promoted me again to sales, and ultimately they put me in charge of human beings. And I was hopeless. I was lousy. In fact, I was pretty bad at the way I treated people, because I just used the system, and the system is still doing that today. So
yes, and I think you use a phrase in some of your, it might have been in your writings or in your podcast, which is the Simply Human podcast, folks. Yep. It's a great podcast. and I'll put a link to it underneath this video. But one of the things you said was that there's a difference between the technical work and the human work. And I love that way of describing it, because I think there's a lot of people who got good at technical work got promoted, but unfortunately, the people that are good at human work, they're not the bosses.
No, they're not.
They didn't get promoted.
No, so they don't. Yeah, sorry.
Just take me through this technical work, human work, because I think it's a lovely way of putting it.
Yeah. So I'm going to say, first of all, both of them are critical. So
yes.
I'm not an anti-technical work guy, because what I've learned over time is that these technical skills, our ability to strategize, our ability to build process and performance, whatever it might be, is really, really important. So we shouldn't lose that. But I guess my premise is, what if we could have both? What if we started to reimagine that work is a combination of both of these things? So my work is very much focused around helping people to reimagine what work is. And it's funny over COVID, because you said that people would call me and say, can you write an article for us on how we can bring more humanity back into the workplace? And I'm like, it's already there. It's just that we've parked it away as this soft, warm and fuzzy, can't measure it, can't manage it. So I want people to be thinking it's not one or the other, it's both. And I think that's sort of where I come from with my work, is bringing in that human side of us, our deep connection, our sense of belonging. Like, we chatted for nearly 35 minutes before we started to record, and we found a dozen things in common, which would help to build a relationship very, very quickly. Whereas these days, people say, we're not allowed to do that because it's not seen as work. I want to encourage organizations to say that is work, and we encourage and applaud you to do that work.
I love an insight from David White, the poet. That's Wythe, I think is the correct. But he said something wonderful. I heard this years ago when I was transitioning. So I read this in around 2010. But he said, in leadership, the conversation is not about the work. The conversation is the work.
Yes. Yeah.
When I heard him say that, I got tears in my eyes, because it described exactly how it should be. And what you and I were doing pre-press record was human work. Yep.
Yeah. And, understanding that it's just a couple of things that came up, that we both, you grew up in Ballarat. I spent time there at Teachers College. I grew up in Mildura. You spent time there working. We both played cricket there. We continue to find things out. And what that does is, like, we're a social creature.
Yep.
The more that we can find out about each other and find things that are not just in common, but things that are different that we can learn from, like, that is important work. And David White's absolutely right. It's what happens between the humans in the conversation that helps the technical work really well, is the way that I've observed it over the last sort of 8 or so years doing the work I do.
Yeah. And I guess I've seen shifts away. For example, I run a couple of peer groups, and we shifted our focus. I first started being involved in peer groups in the 80s. So I've been on the path for a long time. It was the first mastermind group I was ever involved in was me and a bunch of blokes. We thought it would be a good idea to talk about what it meant to be good husbands and good fathers.
Yep.
We're all involved in sport together, the first few of us. And that was my first involvement in the idea that, you learn from your peers. And we spent a lot of time in a mate's shed, sitting around the fire, talking human stuff.
Yep.
Relationships. What our feelings are about. I mean, in those days, and it's still a bit this way, blokes don't talk about their feelings often enough. And so that beginning that way in peer groups got me on a path that it's more important to talk about the person than it is about the work.
Yep. Yeah.
And so my groups have followed that trend ever since. But of recent times, the focus is even more so. We do talk about work and we do talk about work challenges, but most of the conversations we have is about being good humans.
Yeah. And interestingly, most of the work challenges emanate from humans not working well together.
Well,
so
exactly. And as I say to people, this paradox is not a coincidence.
no, and the funny thing is we continue to try and I think of the work of Heifetz and Linsky, we try and find a technical fix to an adaptive challenge, which is
Yes.
we want to change people's beliefs and behaviours. So it's okay for us to talk about how we're feeling. But what we usually do is we'll just write a policy on, whatever it might be. We'll write a new policy on the way we should treat each other at work, and this is what you should follow. But it doesn't take into account that we're human beings. So I think it's a great challenge, but an enormous opportunity, particularly in what we've gone through in the last 2 years. But I applaud you, like in 1980 or 1990, to be running these groups with fellas and talking about that stuff. Like that would have been very foreign back then.
Well, it probably was, although the book Think and Grow Rich, which is where I first learnt about mastermind groups, I think was written in the 30s.
Yep.
I read it in my 30s. And I was at that point, I'd been in the corporate world for about 15 years, and I didn't last much longer after I read that book, because what I found was happening, and interestingly, I worked primarily for, in the corporate, I probably worked for American owners. And what I found was they were good people to socialize with, but they weren't very good at the human stuff in terms of, I found I was being lied to more often than not. And it started me along a path of, do I really want to do this for the rest of my life? And I started looking into what was possible. Fair to say, I had a bit of a midlife crisis. I think I was 32 when I read Think and Grow Rich.
Yep.
But one of the and I'm 68 now, so it's a while ago. But one of the things that stood out about the book, and the book, if you know it or remember the story, and Napoleon Hill was asked by the steel guy, whose name is just not in my mind, to go and interview people and find out what makes them successful. And he came back with 14 insights, one of which was a mastermind group.
Yep.
And I thought, at the time, I thought this is a great idea. So I said to a couple of my mates in the cricket club, look, I've read this book and this is what they reckon successful people do. Why don't we do that? And they went, yeah, why not? And that's how it began. But I think it did just that weekly chat. We became accountable to one another.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think there's no doubt we became better husbands and better fathers as a consequence. But as I saw that, as I saw each of us become better humans, I realised this is something that's important in the workplace, and it wasn't happening in the workplace in 1990. Not too many places.
No, it's interesting. It's as you were talking, the word that was coming up for me, which I guess is the sort of foundation of the work I do, is the word trust. And that, but as you are spending time each of those weeks, first of all, I'm going to make an assumption that you weren't turning up there not trusting each other and waiting for people to demonstrate their competence. You were turning up as a group of well-intentioned blokes going, we're here because we want to be here. So I think there's something here for people to think about the way they look at trust. And a lot of in the workplace, I think the challenging thing in the workplace is trust has always been about capability. And I think it's about, can you do the job, the technical job? And if you can't, I won't trust you. What I think it should be about is, I talk about motive. Others call it integrity. It's like, I turn up with good intention to do good work, and I trust that you do the same thing. So I'm not going to be, looking for when you fail. So I think
that's
trust
nice.
Is huge.
Yes, and I'm sure you found this alongside of that. There has to be a willingness to be vulnerable.
Absolutely. Yeah,
and that's what I learned. I mean, it was easy in that first group because we were mates and we were good friends, and being vulnerable kind of came naturally.
Mm-hmm.
But when I started taking the concept into the first of all the corporate world, and then I left the corporate world and went out and started taking the concept into when I started working for myself, getting people to be vulnerable was a big part of the challenge.
Yeah. And I think one of the challenges there is that we've got to make sure we look at each human being in that room, that they're all at a different stage of. So some people will jump in and they'll just share, and you'll be like, "Wow, geez," and others won't say anything, and there'll be a lot of people in between. I think the challenge and the opportunity here again is that we've got to start to look at this not as a technical skill they're building, but it'll happen over time when we give them the space to feel safe enough. And I come from a family of blokes who didn't like to share much. In fact, if you married a LeBusque man, uncles, whatever they were of mine, the women would say, they don't say much and they don't give us much. But I think you can actually learn it over time. And the only way to learn it is to practice it, feel uncomfortable, realize that the roof doesn't fall in on your head when you share some things about yourself, and then you just step in again and again. And I think that's something for us all to be conscious of, is let people find their own pace. But when they find it, just encourage them to keep doing it.
Yeah. And so how are you finding getting this into the work? Because I agree, trust is if it's not the top of the ladder, it's in the top couple of rungs. A willingness to be vulnerable is there. And I think you touched on it. And it's created by trust and vulnerability, but it's this idea that you create a safe place.
Yep. So look, how do you bring this into a system that's been running like it has for over 100 years? I think first thing is you've got to believe that it's right. So this comes from people like you and me, Ian, to say we've got to be prepared to be rejected and know that people are. I used to get called Kumbaya Mark at one stage. You just do all your Kumbaya work, and so but when you believe it and you see that it can work, I think you've got to be able to show some credibility that you've been through an experiment. And then the other thing I'm going to say here, 3 words that sit with me, and I think human beings, and particularly managers, should really think about this. Hold your nerve is what I say to people. Is that I said to you before we kicked off, is that the game of this human work is a long game. So if someone says to me, could you come in for a couple of days, run a 2-day session for my people and to humanize them, I'm like, go and get yourself a rinse and repeat consultant who'll do all the usual things. And because this is, and I'm not trying to get more work out of you, I'm just telling you that if you're in this, you got to hold your nerve, because it's going to go forward and backward and forward and up and down and sideways. So
Simon Sinek called it the infinite game, and he was
absolutely
he was leaning on an earlier work by James Cass. I like both books, but the one that Cass wrote, I think in 1986 or somewhere around there, it's an infinite game, but most people just want a training course.
Yeah, and leadership's about, look, for managers who are looking to step into this work and they're not quite sure, like, you've got to understand, and you know this very well, as many of your listeners will, is that leadership's about taking personal risk, and you're taking personal risk because there's a better way. I use this isn't my term, but it's like, what are you prepared to lose in order for your team, your department, your organization, your community to gain? That's the hardest thing for us, because we're so used to, we want the rewards and the platitudes and all the good stuff.
Yeah.
We don't want someone to call us Kumbaya Mark, because that might mean we don't get promoted because we're not serious about work. And I'm just saying to people, if you believe in this, don't be reckless and maverick about it, but push the edges of what people believe in, because it's really good when you get through there. It really is.
Yeah, look, I think I remember in the early days, one guy said to me when we have, and it was after a break, and he said, we're not quite sure. He said this out loud in front of the group. He said, we're not quite sure whether you've got religion or you're on drugs or perhaps both. Because it was a bit foreign. I said to that all those groups in the early days, the idea that you can manage a person is a stupid idea.
Yep.
We need to lead people and we need to manage process. and they'd give a lot of pushback in the early days, and then I'd pull out the Drucker quote, because Drucker, even the so-called father of management, he of course was aware of this. He got misquoted more often than probably anyone in the history of management, but he said the task is to lead people. And what I've seen, and I'm greatly encouraged by now 32 years from that moment, I'm now encouraged that there's a lot more people talking about leading people and managing process than there ever was. And I'm optimistic about the future. Are you?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think there's a shift, and I think the shift was happening prior to the pandemic. I think it was starting to occur. This might accelerate things as well. But I have a level of optimism, because if I always go back to, I'll strip it back to, we're actually dealing with human beings here.
Yep.
We're a social species. We love deep connection. We love a strong sense of belonging. We build relationships around trust and trust contracts. We like to share and listen to story. So, like, it's absolutely there in all of us. I think what's happened is, what's taken over for us is, we started to talk about the industry that we worked in, or the title that we had. So if we identified ourselves with a fancy title or an industry I worked in, therefore I must be like this. I keep saying to people, if someone asks me who should come to my program, my simple response is this: do you have any humans in your workplace? And they go, yeah. And I go, just send the humans then. That'll be okay. We'll do good work if humans come.
It's simple yet profound.
Thank you.
One of the fascinating insights that came about just recently in one of my groups, and this is a bunch of people who are both women and men who have been meeting together for, well, at this point in time, they'd been in the room together every week for over 18 months. And without sort of betraying any confidentiality, but what was a profound moment was when someone in that group recognized something in another person that the rest of us already knew about, and yet this person didn't.
Yep.
And it was like, what have you been seeing? And we then had a conversation about why this one person didn't notice what everyone else had noticed. And it was a fascinating insight into the fact that we only see what we want to see. And to be good humans, we've got to be prepared to take a look at what we don't want to see.
Yeah, that's why I love Margaret Heffernan's work. She's got that cool TED talk about super chickens, but she also has a book called Willful Blindness, and our ability just to look away when we should look towards. And yeah,
it's right there. Willful blindness.
One of my favorites, Ian, and I think about just, we do that with ourselves though, and I think this work all starts with self. So like if we continue to look away at the things that we don't want to see in ourselves, we can't but manage or lead others to be able to start to look at themselves. So I think a lot of this work happens with the preparedness for people to look at, what am I bringing that's really useful? I always say, what are you bringing that's helpful? What are you bringing that's harmful? And you need to look at both of those things. And if someone else points it out for you, be respectful enough to say thank you, even though you might be stung a bit by that at the time. Just say thank you and then go away and start to think about it.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. I like the helpful, harmful, dichotomy, as it were. Yeah, I say self-leadership is everyone's business.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it all starts there. And I think the number one skill is self-awareness.
Yep.
And the number two skill closely followed is awareness of others.
Yes.
And yet we live in a world where there's not a lot of self-awareness amongst the public, the leaders in public. We're seeing that in our country here, Australia, at the moment. And I know there'll be some people from the UK who watch this. They've got one as well, and even in the US, I think they've substituted the word awareness with service. So self-service has been
I'm gonna call it the trait of let's call them our elected officials. Let's never confuse it with leadership, because they're elected officials and they don't demonstrate a lot of leadership, regardless of, I think, what colour they are or what party they're in. But I'm not seeing some good things. But it comes back to what you said, Ian. It's leading self is, I reckon, about 75 to 80% of the game.
Yep.
But what happens in leadership, unfortunately, I experienced this, even though I used to love going to development, is we'd spend about 5 minutes on a 360 survey or some sort of tool that they'd use to, this is you, Mark. And then the rest of the time would be spent on how do you motivate your people and how do you have difficult conversations. I think we've got to, and the optimism I have is we turn that around to go, let's spend 70% of the time on ourselves, and then 20, 25%, 30% on leading team and leading organization, because that comes after leading self.
I think you're absolutely spot on. And I mean, just imagine a conversation with any group of people where you spent 70% of the time having a conversation about what's harmful and what's hurtful.
Yep.
That in itself would increase the level of self-awareness. Yeah, look, I'm not surprised now, after doing this work for a long time, that the focus in the peer groups is about personal development.
Yep.
Business development is a second.
It's interesting. My observation, experience in the room is when the work is working and you're doing the real work, people say things like, "Oh, I didn't really like that last session. It felt a bit flat," or "I really liked the stuff we did before when we caught each other falling backwards to show we trusted each other, but I didn't really like it when we started having those conversations because like the room went quiet." And I call it, if you feel like you're walking through quicksand in the room, you're actually doing exactly the work you should be doing. And
no doubt about it.
I think the responsibility of people like you and me is we've got to hold that container to say that you're gonna have to walk through quicksand for a while, people, as I am with you, even though it feels uncomfortable for me sometimes, because once you get out of the quicksand and you wash yourself off and you've experienced it, happy days.
No doubt about it. I'm of a strong belief that we need to have an understanding of what discomfort feels like.
Yep.
Because otherwise you really don't know what comfortable feels like. And it's the same with anything you want to look at. If you don't know hate, you can't know love, and vice versa.
Yeah, and look, I think of a simple
or fear, more to the point. I mean, I think we've got a society at the moment where politicians are trying to manage people through fear. That's my conclusion.
Yep.
And the opposite of fear, of course, is love. I think if we had to love people, we would have had more success with the vaccines than what we've done by trying to mandate it.
Yep. Yep. And then we, and look, you're so right. And then we overlay that with the media, who, like, they just continue to highlight the really negative stuff. And then like, I wonder, because, we're both getting on a little bit in our lives. I said before, I'm about to join the 55 to 64 club when I put my age on something. And but what about young people, like the really young people who are seeing the media, and they'd be just like, what the hell is going on here? And then they're looking for leadership, and it's very, very difficult to find good leadership, whether it be through government, through our own communities and the people. So, I do fear for the impact that these last couple of years are going to have on future leaders. And I think about school kids and things like that, and like, what are we going to do to help them? Have you got any thoughts around that space?
Well, I think that this is why the workplace is a key. I think there are some good educational environments. I don't think there were any when I was a teenager. There are a couple of individuals, maybe, but the system didn't teach me about living.
No.
And I'm still of that view. Yep. I think there are exceptions to that, and so if you just Google Ken Robinson and watch some of his talks, I mean, and he was a prime mover, and a very sad loss losing him.
Yes.
But he was a prime mover in. So I think there is hope in education. My sister works in early childcare, and I hear some stories from her that I do have hope, but the education system is a major problem. I've got no hope, no belief in the political system.
No.
And I think religions have lost the plot, as well. I have respect for whatever faith people have, but I don't have respect for religion, which is, the rules, that the doctrine and the dogma stuff, because that to me is all about control. It's nothing to do with spirituality. So I go through it all, and I come to this conclusion: the workplace is the last bastion, mate. We've got to get it right in the workplace, otherwise we really are screwed.
I agree, because and this is where we've got to get away from. It's not about technically changing. It's not about a policy rewrite or whatever it might be. It's more about what's the experience we want humans to have that allows them to be human. And it is connection, and it's belonging, and it's trust, and it's vulnerability, all of these things. Let's introduce those into the workplace, which what it's going to mean is there are going to be some people that are disadvantaged by this because they've gone through a system that's helped them to get to where they are. But if I'm going to be really blunt about it, I think they've had their time. Yep. And it's now time for, if they can't change and they can't see what they don't want to see, well, it's time to bring, and I don't mean that it's new people through, because I think there's lots of people who have been in the workplace for a long time who are just waiting for the opportunity to really show up as themselves. And
Yep.
So this can come from not just from the new generation. I think it can come from anywhere. And I think sometimes we forget that, Ian, and we think, oh, Mark's 55 now, Ian's 68. They're past it. No, they're not. They've got so much to offer as well.
Yeah. I think so. So where do we start? What are you seeing as good places to start? Because I sense that there is a deep desire for human work.
Yep.
But what are you seeing as good places to start?
Well, the good place to start is to reimagine work. Like I said at the start, it's like there are different types of work, and they're both important. So I think it's starting with conversations about that. Yep. I think the other place we need to start is just in conversation in general. So I have some basic questions that I used to give to my new starters in my team. And the first one was, what do you expect of me? So come and tell me. And it was never that I'd be technically good at selling things. It was like, I want you to be reliable. I want you to support me. And so let's understand people's expectations about each other, regardless of level. And then the second one is about work style preference. And I asked the question to my people, what's your work style preference? So tell me about what it's going to be like for you to do your very best work. And someone might say this to me: I want you to give me a little bit of direction, but then I want autonomy. It's like, cool. So if that's what Ian wants, good. And then someone might say to me, I need to hear from you nearly every day to know that I'm on the right track. Okay, so we need to spend more time in understanding the interaction between each other, create that safe space.
Yeah.
The other one I want to say very quickly is, this might sound really simple, but I'm a simple human being. We need to start to give humans who work with us a sense of why they're relevant and how they contribute as an individual to a team, to a department, to an organization. Because little old Mark or little old Ian, if he doesn't, or she doesn't know that, they can't feel that strong sense of belonging. So I think relevance, contribution, the connection piece, and reimagining work are the starting points. And it's not about a work in progress report or the next program of work. It's just going to enable that to happen better.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that I always start with is, what does it mean to be human around here?
Yeah.
Because I think it's the key culture question. I mean, culture, the question has always been, the way we do things around here. And I only think that's part of the equation. I've got a great mate, Steve Simpson, who does great work in this culture. He calls them unwritten ground, which is a great place to start as well. But I think culture is more than the way we do things around here. It's who are we around here and what does that look like? And
Yeah.
and if that's not how we want it to be, then what does being a real human around here look like? And I think that conversation and bringing in these other things that you're mentioning, anyone can start there, but you've got to have a lot of patience. That's the thing. The change doesn't happen overnight, but when it comes, it comes. And one of the things that I help people to start with is that, take a look at your job descriptions and then get rid of most of them. Because what we actually need is people's roles clarified, and roles have everything to do with relationships, whereas the typical job description lists a whole bunch of tasks and then it says, and anything else is directed down the bottom. Well, that's bullshit. What people need to know is who do I have relationships with, and what's the value being delivered and exchanged. That I put that one in the mixed along with the ones that you say there. All right, Mark, I think it's timely, our little conversation probably coming to an end. I'll put some details about how people can get in touch with you below this video.
Sure.
But a parting word of your best advice to people who are just starting out on this leading humans caper.
Yep. Okay, so my best advice is treat yourself as the first experiment.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And
Wonderful.
Thanks for having me on, mate. This has been an absolute pleasure. It's been 8 years in the making, and I've been delighted. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And what we'll do is next time we'll have an audience, and we'll work out a date for that soon, and we'll put that below the video as well.
I'd love to, mate. I'd love to have that experience with you. Thanks again.
Wonderful.